You know that weird feeling when you've been assigned to vaccinate the population of an entire country, but there are some people who just will not get down with the program. People who, no matter what you say, what you do, or what incentive you put out there, just refuse to take the vaccine. Here in America, this represents somewhere between 19 to about 30% of the population, depending on how you do the numbers. And so, wouldn't it be nice if there was some way that the government could disseminate the vaccine quietly in a way that people wouldn't even realize that they were getting vaccinated? That way, you can achieve your goal with minimal resistance. Well, if that's what you were thinking, you're in luck, because scientists over at Yale University have just taken a giant step towards making such a thing reality. This paper right here that you can see up on your screen was published just 2 weeks ago by researchers over at Yale University. The paper is titled "Polymer Nanoparticles Deliver mRNA to the Lung for Mucosal Vaccination." And what these researchers over at Yale were able to achieve is to develop a new airborne method of delivery for mRNA vaccines. Here is specifically what they wrote in their summary. Quote, "An inhalable platform for mRNA therapeutics would enable minimally invasive and lung-targeted delivery for a host of pulmonary diseases. Here, we report an inhalable polymer-based vehicle for delivery of therapeutic mRNAs to the lung. We optimized biodegradable nanoparticles for mRNA delivery. These nanoparticles achieved high transfection of mRNA throughout the lung, particularly in epithelial and antigen-presenting cells. We applied this technology to develop a mucosal vaccine for severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 and found that intranasal vaccination with spike protein encoding mRNA nanoparticles induced potent cellular and humoral adaptive immunity and protected susceptible mice from lethal viral challenge." Meaning, in plain English, that their experiment proved successful. They were able to vaccinate these mice using 2 doses administered through the nose of a vaccine which contained nanoparticles carrying the mRNA COVID vaccine. These mice were vaccinated without a single injection. And according to the researchers, this experiment showed that this new method of delivery was quote-unquote safe and effective, and they are now planning to test it in humans. Now, if you've been following the development of these aerosol-based vaccines, then you know that this Yale University study represents a significant leap forward in their development. In fact, the Yale School of Engineering and Applied Science, they put out a bulletin on this matter wherein they summarized the significance of this particular experiment in the following way. Quote, "It's a significant advance since scientists have had trouble creating lung-targeted mRNA therapies. Typically, these therapies have had poor transfection efficiency. That is, only a small fraction of administered nucleic acids make it into cells that lead to expression of the encoded protein. Also, in the past, the nanoparticles that deliver the mRNA have caused inflammation and other problems. The Saltzman group got around this hurdle in part by using a nanoparticle made from polyamine coester polyplexes, or PACE, a bicompatible and highly customizable polymer." Now, in the statement of theirs, they mentioned the Saltzman group, named after one of the lead researchers in this Yale study, Dr. Mark Saltzman. And here was how he explained the findings as well as their significance in a separate statement. Quote, "In the new report, there is no intramuscular injection. We just gave 2 doses, a prime and a boost, intranasally, and we got highly protective immune response. But we also found that, generally, you can deliver different kinds of mRNA. So it's not just good for a vaccine, but potentially also good for gene replacement therapy in diseases like cystic fibrosis and gene editing. We use the vaccine example to show that it works, but it opens the door to doing all these other kinds of interventions." Professor Saltzman then added that, quote, "This new method of delivery could radically change the way people are vaccinated, adding that it could make it easier to vaccinate people in remote areas or those who are afraid of needles." And indeed, if this technology were to develop further, well, you can just imagine the compliance factor. Because you might get a lot of people taking the vaccine if you make it a prerequisite for them to keep their jobs. But you will get 100% total compliance across the board if the vaccine is delivered through the air, since at the end of the day, every single person needs to breathe. Now, already I can hear the quote-unquote fact checkers dutifully typing away their critique of this episode by saying that the government has absolutely no plans to vaccinate the population through the air. That is just a conspiracy theory. And technically, they are correct. There are currently no plans in the books to somehow secretly vaccinate Americans through the use of aerosol mRNA-based vaccines. However, there are 2 very important things worth mentioning. The first is that there has long been a strain of thought among so-called biotechnologists that it's the moral thing to do to enhance people's biology in a covert way, since they might not agree to it. As an example of that train of thought, here's a paper that was published in 2019 titled Compulsory Moral Bioenhancement Should Be Covert. And here was the summary from that paper. Quote, some theorists argue that moral bioenhancement ought to be compulsory. I take this argument one step further, arguing that if moral bioenhancement ought to be compulsory, then its administration ought to be covert rather than overt. That is to say that it is morally preferable for compulsory moral bioenhancement to be administered without the recipients knowing that they are receiving the enhancement. My argument for this is that if moral bioenhancement ought to be compulsory, then its administration is a matter of public health, and for this reason should be governed by public health ethics. I argue that the covert administration of a compulsory moral bioenhancement program better conforms to public health ethics than does an overt compulsory program. In particular, a covert compulsory program promotes values such as liberty, utility, equality, and autonomy better than an overt program does. Now, I personally have a significantly different understanding of the word liberty than this author, but setting that aside, this demonstrates that there's already a strain of academic thought moving in this general direction. That's the first point. The second point is that this wouldn't even be the first time that the US federal government secretly administered biological agents through the air. For instance, back in the 1950s, in order to run a simulation of a biological attack, the US Navy conducted something known as Operation Sea Spray. This was when they used airplanes to fly over the city of San Francisco and spray the population with large quantities of a bacteria known as Serratia marcescens. Now, at the time that the experiment was conducted, that particular bacteria was, according to mainstream science, considered harmless. But it actually wasn't. And as a result of their experiments, many people in San Francisco contracted pneumonia-like illness, with at least one person dying as a result. And just as a fun fact, the family of the person who died wound up suing the federal government for gross negligence, but that family actually lost the lawsuit because the federal judge ruled against them. And Operation Sea Spray was not alone. It was one of several dozen different programs wherein the US government secretly administered some form of biologic material onto its citizens, including the Tuskegee experiments, Operation Big Itch, Operation Dropkick, Operation Mayday, Operation Green Run, Operation Top Hat, the Holmesburg program, and so on and so forth. There are many, many, many examples of these different experiments. As unfortunate as it is to say, the US federal government has somewhat of a history of using covert methods to test what they believe is ultimately for the betterment of society. And so with that in mind, you take another look at the situation that we're currently finding ourselves in. You have a huge swath of the federal government, including the federal health agencies, who would do anything to vaccinate the population, going so far as to, over the past 3 years, literally make people unemployable if they fail to comply. You then have these experiments over at Yale University, which are developing a new breed of mRNA vaccines, which can be administered through the air. You then have a strain of thought, of academic thought, being developed among so-called intellectuals, arguing that the administration of these types of quote-unquote moral bioenhancements should be done covertly in order to make them more equitable. And then, of course, you combine all that with the history that the US government already has of using these covert operations, and then it's really not a stretch to imagine that if these aerosol vaccines do develop to the point of being viable at a large enough scale, they could theoretically be deployed without the American citizens being told about them. They would just be deployed for our own good. Now, of course, that is just speculation. There have thus far not been any politicians who have come out and said anything along this line publicly. Although I will also mention that many of those US government experiments that we listed off earlier, well, they weren't announced to the public beforehand either. And in fact, the only reason we know about many of them is because the government was quite literally forced to release the documents when people sued for them.